He from the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians told LBC this doesn't go far enough.
The largest British contribution to Israel's military operations in Gaza and in the West Bank is its production of parts and components for the F-35 fighter jet programme. Those components are unaffected by today's announcement by Lanny. So the reality is the single most important reason for the UK to suspend arms is untouched.
Meanwhile, the Israeli Prime Minister's hit back at US President Joe Biden after he criticised him for not doing enough to secure a hostage deal. Benjamin Netanyahu says international pressure must be focused on Hamas and not Israel. The wife of a Tory councillor from Northamptonshire charged in connection with recent rioting will be sentenced later this month. 41-year-old Lucy Connolly admitted stirring up racial hatred against asylum seekers. And Great Britain have added 6 gold medals to their total at the Paralympic Games in Paris. The latest was secured by Nathan McQueen and Jodie Grinham in the mixed team archery. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed down 12 points at 83.63. The pound buys $1.31 and €1.18. LBC weather, scattered showers from the west tonight, rain clearing in the north and a low of 8 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
One-word Ofsted ratings will be scrapped.
Julia Waters, who's professor and sister of Ruth Perry, of course, the teacher, who I think in many ways has informed this change.
The teaching profession is breathing a sigh of collective relief this morning at the start of a new school year without that pressure of a single-word judgment hanging over them anymore. It's a great move. It's a pity it didn't come in sooner. It's a terrible, bittersweet moment for my family.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. This is Cross Question.
And it's Simon Marks once again in for Ian Dale, and delighted to be inaugurating a new season of Cross Question on Ian's behalf. You can join the discussion every Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday night at 8 p.m. right here on LBC with our esteemed panel of invited guests. And tonight they comprise Alison McGovern, the Employment Minister, David Simmonds, the Shadow Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Housing, the playwright, author and Byline Times columnist Bonnie Greer, and Henry Hill, the Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome. The phone lines are open. There's a slot on the switchboard for your question to Cross Question. You might want to ask about the crisis in the Middle East and the government's efforts today to restrict arms sales to Israel, about the government's performance so far and your views of Keir Starmer's honeymoon period up until now, about whether the government should crack down on ticket resale prices after you spent hours trying to secure a place at one of the upcoming Oasis gigs, or about anything else that is on your mind. And you don't have to listen to Cross Question on the radio. You can even watch us in glorious Technicolor right now on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
And so a warm welcome to the first Cross Question of the new season. Parliament's back, and so Cross Question's back. And I'm delighted to have all of my guests with me in the studio tonight. Let's go straight to the phones and to Zach, who has called in from Maidenhead in Berkshire. Zach, good evening to you. What's your question for the panel?
Good evening, panel. My question is this a little bit too late in the day, and why 10%? Why not ban all the weapon sales to Israel, considering 40,000 people have died? The International Criminal Court has stated it's a genocide. By all accounts, with all morals or values, this isn't in the UK's interest anymore. Why are we still sending any weapons?
Alison McGovern, we've had several callers in the last hour when we were talking about this issue saying this is too little too late.
Well, the conflict is absolutely devastating. It's dreadful. And whether it's the need for peace, security, humanitarian response, we all want to see better things happen. It's just an absolutely dreadful, abysmal situation. On this specific issue, the announcement that the Foreign Secretary made today, I wasn't in the House of Commons, but I read his statement afterwards, and he laid out what the law requires, which is basically if there is a clear risk that an export could risk, humanitarian rights, that export license cannot be granted. And it's an ongoing responsibility. So when the Foreign Secretary came into office, he asked for this review to be undertaken, and he has made a judgment on that basis. Is there a clear risk for this individual licence that those arms could be used in a way that would...
What I don't understand is if there's a clear risk that 10% of the arms are going to be used in the commission of actions that would breach international law, why is there not a clear risk that the other 90% might be used in that?
Well, as the Foreign Secretary laid out, obviously getting information in a situation like this is very challenging. So you have to make the best forward-looking judgment that you can. Parliament and the responsibility that the government has on this to Parliament. It's not a court, it's not backwards looking, it's not making a judgment. You're trying to make your best estimation of what granting this particular export licence would do. And the Foreign Secretary laid out in each of the individual cases the judgment that he had made. As I said before, it's an ongoing responsibility. So, we will be engaging with this as long as this terrible conflict is going on. But, whether it is the situation for families who have loved ones who are hostages and the dreadful situation that we saw at the weekend and the loss of life, whether it is Palestinian families unable to live anything like a normal life, and the need for everybody to have peace and security, you just hope against hope that we can get to a better situation.
David Simmonds, what is the Conservative Party's position on this? Because Andrew Mitchell spoke in the Commons today and didn't say very much about this particular decision by David Lammy. Do you support it? Has he gone too far? Has he not gone far enough?
The opposition and Parliament generally hasn't seen the detail of the evidence that lay behind David Lammy's decision. Personally, I find it disappointing that after a strong cross-party position since the start of this conflict, that we supported Israel's right to self-defence, and we called for them to show restraint to make sure that the rules both of war and humanitarian rules were always followed by the Israeli Defence Force. There's a risk that that consensus breaks down. And at a point when we have seen some positive signs of de-escalation in the conflict, of a potential return to the path to a longer-term peace settlement, I am concerned that if allies of Israel are seen to be backing away, that may further destabilise the situation and lead to the conflict persisting. And because the UK has never been a significant arms exporter to Israel anyway, we supply a small amount of military equipment rather than munitions. I'm not sure this is going to have a huge impact on the thinking of the Israeli military, but I am concerned that it potentially sends a message to the international community that maybe that consistent support for the right of Israel as the only democracy in the region to exist is beginning to soften a bit at a time when we need to show that we are foursquare behind them and foursquare behind that longer-term agenda of peace.
Bonnie Greer, we heard earlier today Joe Biden saying that he believes that Benjamin Netanyahu is not doing enough to advance the cause of ceasefire negotiations and a hostage rescue. How does David Lammy's decision to make this arms restriction play into thinking in Washington, D.C.?
Well, as was stated by the Secretary of State, that the Foreign Secretary has to, first of all, operate under UK law. I don't know what that law is, so I can't speak to that. He also has information that none of us have about actually what's going on. So he has to work in that area too. And every foreign secretary would have to do that. The UK is sovereign in its decisions in relation to any country, and those decisions have to be made in the interests of the United Kingdom. And this, by the Secretary of State's assessment, is what he's decided to do. If it was me, I would ban them, but that's why I'm not Secretary of State. You
would ban all the weapons?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But what has happened is that all of us as nations have decided the way that we wage war. We've made a decision. We formed an organization called the United Nations, and we've decided this is how you wage war, even under the most egregious provocations. We wage war this way. Israel's not doing that. But as I say, I go back to the Foreign Secretary's decision. I respect that. And he's got all the information, and I trust that he knows what he's doing.
Henry Hill, is this too little too late?
No. Well, I don't think particularly. I don't as everyone has said, we don't know the basis for the decision. It's not entirely sort of automatic and judicial. Of course, there is a political element to this. The Foreign Secretary makes a decision on advice, but that can be challenged via judicial review, and unless that happens, then the decision will stand regardless. And so I don't think we can pretend that the change of government has probably had no effect on this. To answer your caller's question, the reason we tend to have quite a granular approach on a per licence basis is because some equipment is much more likely to be used in a way that breaches international law than others. And so we don't do a blanket export for that. That would imply that the United Kingdom thought Israel's entire war operation was illegitimate, which is not the current position. So in terms of negotiating peace, however, it's very challenging, because obviously Netanyahu, or the Israeli government, is torn between, it doesn't want to permanently occupy the West Bank. Neither Israel nor Palestine wants that to happen. But on the other hand, the government is not prepared to have the West Bank Gaza return to being effectively a city-state run by Hamas, with the sole purpose of taking on the Israeli government. And it's currently very hard to see a way out of that position. The final problem on the quick subject of international law is that there is not a single unified internationally agreed way to wage war. It depends on which treaties each individual country has signed up to, and several of the laws that Israel has been alleged to have broken are part of treaties to which it is not a signatory.
And we had several callers in the last hour making the point that why is the British government doing this with regard to Israel when it is not taking similar action with regard to Saudi Arabia, for example, and other places where appalling things are being done, potentially with British supplied weapons and components. Alison, is this the beginning of a new approach to foreign policy by Keir Starmer's government, or is this one and done when it comes to Israel?
Well, as I said before, the responsibility is ongoing. Where you have an active conflict, clearly there's going to be more for the Foreign Office and others to pay attention to. They, be monitoring exactly what's happening, though it is, often hard to get the absolute clear facts. So actually it applies everywhere, and it's consistent and applied under the last government too. And the final point I'd make on this is that Parliament does also have a responsibility, and we will shortly get select committees, and I'm sure that there will be discussion through the select committee process, because while, whatever the party politics of it, I want to be in a country where we trust that this bit of the law that protects human rights is carried out properly, and I think Parliament should be playing a role in scrutinising that, whatever party. So we'll get into that, and I'm sure other areas will be looked at as well.
Can I just reply to that, to what you were saying about there's not one treaty that we've signed, or you implied that no, there isn't. You're absolutely right, but there was decision collectively made after World War II about how we wage wars, particularly when vulnerable populations are at play. The United States has violated it numerous times, and now we're in a situation where we have a vulnerable population caught in between this. Israel's responsibility as a signatory, as a member of the United Nations, is to be mindful and careful of that population, even to the extreme of having to not occupy the Philadelphia corridor or the other places it wants to be. That's called civilization, and that's what we have to do, and we have to hold Israel to it. And there are people in Israel who are trying to hold Israel to this, but we've got a government that doesn't want to do that.
David Simmonds, can I just ask you, from a Conservative Party perspective, are you concerned that this is a thin end of the wedge by the new Labour government, and you're not quite sure where the thick end of the wedge leads to?
The lack of clarity is always the issue. Now, we know most governments have a strategy that encompasses things like international law, the deployment of overseas development assistance, and indeed engagement with the likes of the United Nations when it comes to achieving common standards. And it's not clear at the moment where the government is going with this. Now, we know there have been some quite egregious breaches of human rights in places like China that have been raised in Parliament. We also know that there's been an element of international judicial activism, some countries taking matters to the International Criminal Court, for example, with a political motivation rather than a legal motivation behind it. So we need to make sure, and it's Parliament's role to ensure, that the government is honest and straightforward in the reasons behind its thinking. I think we're looking forward to hearing David Lammy set out what that strategy might look like over the coming months.
OK, more of your questions for our cross-question panel tonight. Alison McGovern, the Employment Minister, David Simmonds, Shadow Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Housing, the playwright, author and Byline Times columnist Bonnie Greer, and Henry Hill, the Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome. You know the numbers. We look forward to hearing from you. The time on LBC is 8:15.
Tom Swarbrick, Monday to Friday from 4 p.m.
Look at the problem we've got. Look at the issue that there now is. And here we have another knife crime incident, an 11-year-old girl, and they've been stabbed.
Listen on your radio and Global Player. Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
And it's Simon Marks in for Ian Dale with the inaugural session of Cross Question for the new season. And our next question comes from Chris in Richmond. Good evening, Chris. What's your question?
Good evening, Simon panel. Should the government continue to press ahead with the cuts to the winter fuel allowance for elderly people in order to balance the books and fund other expenditure?
Well, let's mix this up. David Simmonds, should the government continue to plan to press ahead with its winter fuel cuts?
It's a political choice for the government to make whether they press ahead with this or indeed cancelling new hospital programmes and things like that we've heard about from the Chancellor. But it is a political choice. It's not something that's necessary to balance the books. Just before the parliamentary recess, we voted as a parliament on the estimates put forward by the government, which set out in detail the funding that was necessary to fulfil commitments made by the previous government, including things like capital investment in the hospitals programme and also the day-to-day expenditure that government departments needed to go forward in order to fulfil what had been committed to. Just a few days later, a mysterious black hole emerged. Now, clearly, the Chancellor, when the Shadow Chancellor, the government, when Shadow Ministers had full access to all the information that the Treasury uses to put forward, including the information that the OBR use when advising government. So there's no question that they knew exactly what the situation was. They've made the political choice, which is for them to justify, about very significant, mainly overinflation pay rises for large cohorts of public sector workers, which essentially is sucking money out of the budget that could be used to fund things like this. That is a political choice, and Parliament's role is to say to the government, are you confident and can you tell the people that this is a political choice you're confident in, especially given you put the previous government under a lot of pressure to promise to maintain the winter fuel allowance, a commitment which was given.
Alison McGovern, I think David Simmonds doesn't believe you found a mysterious black hole.
Well, he's quite wrong about that. And if David was right, then why is it that the OBR themselves have launched an investigation into what happened here and that information wasn't made available during the period of the election or even before. The OBR themselves have said that they didn't know the full picture and are having an investigation. So if the picture was as David described it, what is that investigation about? And the OBR wouldn't be doing it. So I just don't think the position as set out is credible. There are certainly things that we didn't know. There's much that you don't know about as an opposition. And if you look at some of the overspends, for example, in the Home Office, we knew the Rwanda scheme was a massive waste of money, but there were other areas of overspend that we definitely didn't know about. And when it comes to the public sector pay awards, those are pay awards that the last government could have dealt with, that were on their desks, that they chose not to. So they did leave us a mess to deal with, and doing so involves difficult choices. And there's no doubt about it. Given the choice, none of us would really want to do this. The problem that we have is that we have a limited set of choices, and pensioners are protected through the triple lock, which is important, and we need to make savings in order to help with the current situation in this year's budget. If we don't do it, that will cause economic instability, and we have a big reform plan. We want to help fix our NHS so that we can get people off waiting lists and back to work. In my own area, I've got a lot of work to do to change job centres so that they offer people real and genuine help, and not the tick box culture that we've had where people just don't get help to get a good job. So we've got a big reform to do. We cannot have a rocky budget this year, and that's why we have to take the hard decision.
Henry Hill?
On no one's fuel allowance, yeah, absolutely the right thing to do. They should do the same thing to the triple lock. This country, the over 65s are, on average, this country's wealthiest age cohort, both by asset wealth and, in 2017, I think they overtook working age households in terms of weekly income. Now, that's not to deny that there are lots of older people in difficult circumstances, which is why means testing is appropriate, in the same way that there should be targeted support for people who are actually dependent on the state pension and don't have other pensions to top it up. But at a time when the forward projections for the NHS, social care and other core revenue budgets are going up and up and up, and we've got an ageing population, departmental budgets are stretched, hosing money at universal benefits for this country's wealthiest generation is insane public finance management, and this is a small step in the right direction.
Alison, can I ask you if you're uncomfortable that you are sort of sharing a degree of the same position with Henry Hill on this?
I don't think we do actually share the same position, because I defended the triple lock, and you just heard it criticised, and I assume you.
Why should pensions grow faster than wages forever?
Well, people who are pensioners have worked hard all of their lives, and it's been part of the social security settlement for a very long time.
2010.
The
triple lock is 2010.
Okay. No, I meant the universality of the state pension. I didn't mean the triple lock. We don't. No, but you implied that you wanted to
get rid of the triple lock.
If I can just finish, then hopefully we'll make some progress on clarifying the disagreement, which is that we want pensioners to be protected from poverty. When the last Labour government came into office in 1997, pensioner poverty was really high and was really a big worry. And now, pensioners are in a relatively better position. So we want pensioners to be protected. As I said before, nobody really wanted to take this decision, but you're looking at a budget for this year and thinking, this is not sustainable, this cannot be done. You've got to take a hard decision. It is a pretty abysmal inheritance. However, we have big reforms to make. We want to change the way that the health service works so it serves people better, which will help our population be more well, and then they'll be able to work more, which will help grow our economy. In other areas, we want to see people doing better jobs, and we've got an investment plan, particularly around new forms of energy, that will also get people better jobs and help people do better. But we can't do any of that if we don't make sure the budget this year is fixed and stable.
Okay, Bonnie Greer.
I've lived in this country half my life, and I vote. I've been a voter since the middle of the 90s and privileged to be a citizen. But let me just say something. I'm listening to all three of you, and I'm thinking to myself, and this happens with every government. How come the other government, the incoming government, opens up like this horror show, chess, and go, oh my God, we didn't know this was here. I mean, this is every government, new government. And well, why not?
I mean,
why don't you know?
Maybe I can answer that, because when I was in opposition, I used to table parliamentary question after parliamentary question, trying to get underneath the truth of what was going on. And there are plenty of things that it turns out governments just don't have to say. And then
What do you mean they don't have to? To the opposition?
Yeah.
They don't have to say things to you.
And they don't. And as I was saying before, it turns out...
I'm not saying it in an accusatory way. I'm saying it as this is news to me.
We clearly have a scrutiny problem, and we know that because the OBR are saying they're having an investigation about that. I think that there's much more that we can do to make sure that we don't have this roundabout next time. And in fact, we're trying to legislate to make sure that the OBR has more powers to make assessments about budgets, learning from the Liz Truss experience and making sure that the OBR has the powers that they need to give Parliament a true representation of the actual.
But you know that's not good enough, right? Because pensioners are the ones that can take the hit because there's something you didn't know and something the Tories did. I mean, I'm just listening to this and thinking, this is mad.
Do you think, Bonnie, that there is something to be said for the UK to emulate the transition that takes place in the United States? Because, I mean, I know we didn't have much of one between when Donald Trump came into office, but traditionally there is that interregnum period and there's a formal process of transition where the incoming administration and the outgoing administration sit down together and say, right, let me tell you what's going on.
Well, as crazy as the United States is and messed up, one of the things that it actually adheres to is the belief that the government is the people's government. So you get in there and you're there because the people want you there. So your job is to make sure that the people are served and they get the info. So the opposition and the party in government, they need to talk to each other and show things to each other. This isn't a game.
David Simmonds, what's your view on the way this transition was handled? Because Bonnie's right, this happens time and again. There's always an incoming government, sometimes yours, sometimes theirs, that says, whoa, where was all the money?
Yeah, and I think Bonnie's point about an effective transition period so that the government is able to do its job is absolutely spot on. But I think this all comes back down simply to political choices. Now, we know government in the UK, in any country, has a certain amount of money to spend and then needs me to make decisions about what the priorities of that are going to be. The incoming government clearly has a different set of priorities, which is perfectly reasonable for them to have. They've chosen to spend those resources in a different way. However, what is simply not accurate is to say that this is all because of some terrible inheritance. If we look at every significant economic indicator, people in work, tax rates, numbers of people unemployed, youth unemployment was half when the Conservative left office from what it was when the previous Labour government left office.
I'm sorry, but
most of these major indicators we've seen huge
no
progress.
comparison, David,
simply
because
to try and argue.
There's no comparison.
So I think we kind of respectfully trying to let each other finish.
Go ahead.
And I think, where Henry started, I thought was a really helpful point. The issue around the winter fuel allowance, intergenerational poverty and intergenerational wealth, that is a subject for debate on which government and political parties need to take a view. And I hope that those who are aspiring to be the new Conservative leader will listen to what people like Henry are saying and say, right, where does this fit into our overall economic strategy? But to argue that taking away a planned piece of spending for a group of pensioners who, in some cases, were going to be depending upon that, and arguing that it's because of a, frankly, mythical black hole, when all of this information has been available. And we talk about transition. We don't just make those books available during the transition period. They are open to the opposition the whole time. The Shadow Chancellor, when she was the Shadow Chancellor, had the same opportunities as Jeremy Hunt when he was the Chancellor to get into these figures. If she failed to do her job properly, she can't blame that on the previous government.
OK, Alison, a minute to respond.
OK, it's just not the case that the economic inheritance is any good. And in 2010, we were coming off the back of a global financial crisis. So the comparison with youth unemployment is not right. The problem today is that the population is sick. It's not well. We have 2.8 million people out of work, long-term sick. And what we have got is a economy that is not really growing in the way that it should. That's why our first priority has been to get things moving, particularly on housing and planning. And that's why we need to get the NHS sorted, hence our choice to get public servants back to work so that we can make sure that we can get everybody else a good health service that will help our economy grow.
OK, more of your questions on Cross Question. We're here until 9 o'clock, but at 8:30, the news headlines come from Daryl Jackson.
An Israeli minister says UK government's decision to ban some arms exports sends a problematic message to Hamas. The Foreign Secretary David Lammy made the announcement in the Commons, saying they could be used to break international law. A Tory councillor whose wife has admitted stirring up racial hatred during last month's riots says she was an upset housewife. 41-year-old Lucy Connolly pleaded guilty to publishing threatening or abusive material on social media. And Transport for London says it's currently dealing with an ongoing cyber security incident. The organisation hasn't shared specific details, but says no customer data has been compromised. LBC weather: scattered showers from the west tonight, rain clearing in the north and a low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC.
Services.
Cross Question on LBC.
The first edition of Cross Question of the new season. My guests in the studio tonight are Alison McGovern, the Employment Minister. She is the Member of Parliament for Birkenhead. David Simmonds, the Shadow Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Housing. He is the Member of Parliament for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner. The playwright, author and Byline Times columnist Bonnie Greer, and Henry Hill, the Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome. And our next question on 0345 6060973 comes tonight from Ulf in Hamburg in Germany. Good evening, Ulf. How is Hamburg tonight?
Good evening. It was very sunny. It was very pleasant.
I'm delighted to hear it. What is your question?
My question? Many conservative or centre-right parties in Europe have been more or less devastated by nationalist populists taking away their votes. The Tories lost in no small part to the depredations of the Reform Party, which I would consider nationalist populist. On the other hand, the German Conservatives, the CDU, is rather strong. They will probably win the next federal elections, and their chairman, Mr. Merz, will probably be the next German chancellor. The German CDU is staunchly pro-European, and they won't give our nationalist populists, the ID, not even the time of day. They will have nothing to do with them. Wouldn't that be a model for the Tories to become electable again?
Henry Hill, should the Conservatives become pro-EU and centrist in order to become electable?
Well, I mean, no. Well, first of all, Germany and Britain are obviously different countries, and the centre-right needs to tack to the winds in each one. Two, I think that's a slightly, obviously, my understanding of German politics might be flawed, but it's a slightly strange reading of what's happened to the CDU, because the CDU was an arch-centrist party under Angela Merkel, and then it got devastated. And actually, what's happened under the new leadership is that it has moved rightwards, and thus consolidated its position as a constitutional, respectable right-wing party, and thus staunched the flow in most places, not in the former East Germany, as we've seen in the local elections, or the Länder elections, to AfD. So the role of a Conservative party, especially in a broadly two-party system like ours, is that, yes, it has to be the centre-right party, it has to be a respectable constitutionalist party, but on the other hand, it has a responsibility to try and keep most right-wing voters inside that tent and not leave a vast territory to its right which a new party led by Nigel Farage or somebody else can fill.
David Simmonds, is there a path for the Conservatives to become a pro-EU party?
Well, I think Henry's analysis is spot on, and I've got a lot of sympathy with what Ofsted. I did a lot of work in European politics, and I've always been a big admirer of the CDU because of their ability, like the British Conservative Party, to reinvent their politics and their approach for each new generation. And when I look at our current leadership election and what it means for the future of my party, for the opposition and for the country, it very much strikes me that every new leader and every new generation creates a new political coalition. And the Labour Party do this as well. It's not something that's unique to the Conservatives. But if we think about what David Cameron did in the path of bringing the Conservatives back to power, he was very much green. He had a particular agenda that brought in a group of voters who were different from those who were attracted by Boris Johnson or indeed Margaret Thatcher or Edward Heath. So each of them was able to articulate within broad Conservative principles an agenda that was appropriate for the right and the centre-right of its day. I think it would be a big mistake for us to go into our leadership election and the next general election thinking that the challenge is to try and get people who were Conservative in 2019 to all vote for us again. We need to be articulating what that new coalition looks like, how we appeal in particular to younger people, how we are challenging the government. You know, Angela Rayner won't say today that she'll keep the single occupancy discount for people on council tax, which is something which councils have suggested should be abolished. Huge impact on the household budget of single young people who are renters and on older pensioners particularly. And those kind of groups will be looking at this and thinking, all right, so you've got an opposition party. What is your opposition agenda? What would you do in government instead? And we need to make sure that we've got answers for those people.
And in the Conservative leadership stakes, who are you backing?
As a member of the Whip's office, I have no official position on any of the candidates.
I see.
But I promise I will be voting.
You will be voting, but you could tell us, but you'd have to kill us. Bonnie Greer.
Well, not being on the right or a conservative and not thinking about them very much at all, just to put my 2 cents in this, it seems that what conservatives have to do, because I don't want right-wingers to have anything, but I think what conservatives have to do is decide who they are in relation to the world that's evolving now. It's very interesting in the United States, the Republican Party, which has actually become a personality cult, has to decide how it's going to function with conservative voters with a small c who are now standing out there thinking, we can't vote for this guy. So I think the dilemma is for conservatives to see how they're placing themselves in the world now, a rapidly changing world. They have some opportunities, I don't want to say, but they do. But they need to distinguish themselves between whatever a right-winger is. And today in Germany, with Alternative for Germany getting that big election win, that's some scary stuff. And the conservatives have to decide who they are in relation to that.
Alison McGovern, it's not your party, but who should they decide that they are?
Well, I think in this country we know who they are because we've just had 14 years of them. So I think we understand who the Tories are in this country. I think that people should do what's right in politics, and I think they should base their decision on what they believe in and what's right. And, whether people describe it as left or whatever, I think people should do what they believe is right. And I think the main thing in the kind of turbulent and horrendous politics that we've seen from some in the far right, I think we've got to show, and I want to show as part of the Labour government, that we can do things for people, that we can help people. As I said, in my own area, I'm very focused on trying to work out how we can get people better jobs, because People have worked very hard for their poverty over the past 14 years, and that has got to change. So we want to get on with the job and change the country to show that we can really do things for people.
But can I ask you a question, Alison? Everything that you just said is good, but I think a conservative would say the same thing. I mean, what does the Labour Party, what is the Labour Party in relation to what is happening, the way the country is now, the way the country has been left? What exactly is the Labour Party? How is it going to proceed through the next couple of years? I think that's the question.
So I think on the point that I was just making on poverty and work, I think we will see the difference between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, because we will be putting forward in legislation our plan to make work pay by giving people more rights at work. And I would be very surprised if the Conservative, maybe David wants to jump in and correct me, but I would be very surprised if they supported us.
Have they stolen some of your lines?
On what we are, I want a country where people feel they've got opportunity and where communities can come together. And I think we've seen too much division, especially in recent months. And I want the Labour Party to be, and the Labour Party that I know at its best is a big coalition of people who all come from different backgrounds, who think that working people should get better opportunities and that working people are good enough to run the country. That's our purpose, that's who we are, and that's what we're for. And I think we are showing that in the decisions that we have already taken, and we will do that again and again over the years to come.
OK, let's move on to our next question. It comes in on text from Julie, and she asks, is the government letting bad schools off the hook by taking away Ofsted's rating system? We are going to be talking about this Ofsted change in the next hour of the programme. But Henry Hill, they haven't actually taken away Ofsted's rating systems, but they are changing the nature of the rating system and making it more nuanced and researched. Do you think they've made a mistake? Are they making, as Julie puts it, are they letting bad schools off the hook?
I don't think they're making it more researched. Ofsted's full reports are always available. They're changing how it's presented, which is slightly different. They're replacing the one-word grade with a report card. Now, a lot of that depends on how the report card is done, right? Because, there is maybe a shortcoming with the one-word system in as much as I think 80-something% of schools all had the top 2 grades and so on. That could have been more granular. It might be that parents want more information. Making more information more accessible is good. On the other hand, there's no reason you couldn't have had the report card and the headline grade. And I'm suspicious because if you look at it, this has been very, very much welcomed by the teaching profession. And the fact is that if you look back both through the Conservative era and the New Labour era, the one group which has been very strongly opposed to an awful lot of the accountability metrics which have helped drive parental information and help drive up school standards have been teachers. I think just today they were saying that we shouldn't be testing kids on their times tables, for example. So it could be a good thing if the information is good and if it still gives a clear message to parents. But if, on the other hand, it creates a whole lot of metrics, and actually some of those are what you really want, academic outcomes and all the rest of it, but then there are just a lot of others, and it just creates chaff, that could make life harder for parents. So it's all about the implementation. Alison?
The one-word judgment's reductive, confusing. I don't think they help parents. You can, of course, read the full Ofsted report, and that's important. It should be written in accessible language. This is about making the system better. Schools have got to be accountable. There's a whole lot of ways in which we need Ofsted to improve, and they're talking more about that in the week to come. But there's the one word, we don't give people one GCSE. We have a balanced set of results. So I think let's not have reductive one-word judgments.
David?
It's a worrying sign. I chaired the National Employers Organisation for School Teachers and worked with the last Labour government when they were in office, and I know, having engaged directly with the teaching unions for many years on it, they were always concerned in particular about, as Henry described, the impact of these one-word judgments on schools. Now, there is a wider debate about making sure that mums and dads and school teachers and other stakeholders have got good information about what's really going on in a school. And we know if we look at somebody's GCSE grade, for example, as Alison said, you get a grade that tells you how you scored in that examination, and then there's more information that you can usually dig out behind that to tell you about which bits you did better at and less so. But we need to make sure that parents are genuinely in the driving seat. It's been a factor behind the transformatively improved standards in education in England. Wales, unfortunately, under Labour, has absolutely languished in those league tables, whilst England's moved significantly ahead. We've now got the best readers in the developed world as a result of the progress that's been made. And there are issues in the overall education system, in particular young people who are sitting outside that system, that need to be addressed. And what concerns me is like the fact that one of the government's first political choices was to prioritise big pay rises for their mates in the unions in respect of education. The first priority is to do the thing that the teaching unions are being asking for, rather than the thing that, from a public policy perspective, is most important for the life chances of our young people.
Bonnie.
You know, as a former teacher, I've been chancellor of a university, I've taught on a state level, and I've taught in private schools. There's not enough respect for teachers in this country, to be honest with you. Teaching, when that door closes, it's you and the student. And I'm not a parent, so I can't speak as, what parents expect. I have no idea what they expect. But I can say within a classroom, the most important thing is that engagement between that teacher and that student. We have to have the best people to teach, and that means giving them more money. Teachers need to have more money in order to do their best work, and the state system should be the best system, not a private system. The state system should be the best. And the best education should be for every child. That should be the bottom line, I think, for every political party.
OK, we're going to move on to a question next about housing, but at the moment the time on LBC is 14 minutes to 9.
This is LBC.
Apply.
Cross question on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
And our panel tonight is Alison McGovern, the Employment Minister, David Simmonds, the Shadow Parliamentary Undersecretary for Housing, the playwright, author and Byline Times columnist Bonnie Greer, and Henry Hill, Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome. And our next question is from Peter in Haringey. Good evening, Peter.
Hello, Simon. Yes. What can be done? What realistically can be done to solve the intractable housing crisis created by the previous Tory government?
Well, Alison McGovern, you are the Employment Minister, but let's start with you. What on housing can Labour do to improve things that Peter argues is an intractable series of problems left over by 14 years of Conservative rule?
Well, the thing that I would like to do is to build more homes, and particularly in my neck of the woods, in Merseyside, where we've got a lot of derelict areas, and we had a big underspend in the money that was allocated for so-called brownfield land. I would like to build homes, affordable homes and social homes, working with housing associations, and that's why Labour have, made the planning system better, and also we want to allocate planning resources, because sometimes it's the technical skills in councils that we're lacking. We had all of those council cuts. So getting on and building is what I would like. I would like that for the country, but most of all, I would like to deal with the dereliction, because it stops people having a home, and then everyone else in that place also has to deal with, the place not looking as good as it could. So build homes would be my
Anything wrong
priority.
with that, David Simmonds?
Addressing dereliction is a very important issue, but clearly that's not what the new government have set out. The first priority they set out was that they would reduce greenbelt protections, and although they haven't done anything yet, they've simply started a consultation on changes to the National Planning Policy Framework. It concerns me that when there are 1.4 million homes with planning permission already granted in this country, that rather than prioritise getting those homes built, we're seeing the government saying, let's make it easier for developers to concrete over green spaces in London and the South East, and simply continue to neglect the opportunities in other parts of the country. So I'd like to see the government bringing in some really significant market reforms, looking potentially at things like changes to the way council tax operates, looking at changes to the way that the planning system operates, and in particular changing the way the appeals system operates, so you don't have a situation where sites are simply arbitrage between developers for increasing value, rather than actually building the homes that we need to build.
Bonnie Greer.
Okay, I'm going to say something blasphemous as an urbanite. I'd rather see somebody off the street in a house than see another patch of grass, to be honest with you. We need to build more homes. We need to enable young people to get on some sort of housing ladder. They need to be able to think that at some point in their lives before they're 80, they can actually own some property, because that's how the society runs. So I would say build more homes, and also the government can find a way, especially in rural areas, to preserve the landscape, preserve the area. It's important for human beings to be able to see something, I've been flippant, but to see something green. But the first priority is to house people. That's the most important thing.
And we had a big area that got planning permission. David Cameron came to celebrate this big area in the Wirral getting planning permission in 2011. And we haven't begun to fill it all yet. And so the past 14 years have been so frustrating, and it was to do with council cuts and just not getting enough done. So we have to crack on and build.
Henry Hill?
Right. This country's housing problem goes back really as far as it was seen coming in the 70s, and it kicked off in the mid-90s, right? Or the mid-80s. To get to historical, 1948, we nationalised the planning system and created a whole set of perverse incentives where basically we don't get anything built. This has been building for decades. Between 1997 and 2007, we pumped a vast amount of credit into the housing market, which whacked up prices without increasing supply. Every government of both parties, essentially since the war, is culpable for the mess that we're in now. And actually, Bonnie is completely right. What you need to do is to ease the actual housing crisis, is build millions of homes where the crisis is, which is our largest cities and the southeast and east of England. And actually, if you did allow cities to expand, as they historically did, Manchester, London, Birmingham, they all grew out into the countryside. That's how they got where they are today. If you look at European capitals, over the last 100 years, they've expanded into the countryside. We've banned our cities from doing the same. And the result is that actually not only are house prices sky high, not only are people packed into HMOs into their 20s and into their 30s, but it actually puts huge pressure on urban green space. Because suddenly there's much less room for parks, there's less room for gardens, developers are having to cram stuff in, they're building towers. So yeah, allow cities and towns where the housing crisis is most acute to expand. Labour has very, very limited plans to build on the Green Belt. The Grey Belt proposals are sort of for overhauling derelict sites, but those are expensive to develop, and Labour have attached an awful lot of everything bagel approaches to the affordability costs. We need to just build on the Green Belt, build millions of homes in the south of England.
Briefly, Alison?
Well, I don't quite agree that we should just focus on those areas where, you've got this sky-high demand, because we also need to rebalance our economy. And I want to see cities in the north of England grow in the way that they can, and we still have a huge amount, as I said, of derelict areas where the housing market doesn't work well.
Those areas have housing shortages specifically. Like the north needs a lot of investment, but in a lot of those areas, housing is quite cheap.
But the quality of supply is really poor. So it's not just about building, as I would want to do, but it's also about making sure that you've got good insulation so that you improve the housing stock so that people can buy a good home.
But it's not either or. Would you build in the south, yes or no?
I would like to see homes built where people need them, and many of those will be in the south of England.
OK,
yes.
We have a follow-up question for Alison that comes in on text from Paul in Bolton. It's a yes or no answer, I think, but maybe not. Should the new Labour MP, Jas Atwell, have the whip removed for renting out 15 properties and his tenants who are living in terrible conditions?
I mean, that's one for the chief whip, but I mean, the condition, as I've only seen what was reported, is terrible, and I think he's apologised as he should.
Is that enough?
I mean, that is one for the chief whip, and I'm going to not give a yes-no answer to that because it's not my responsibility.
OK, I'm going to move on to another question because we're running out of time, and I want to get to this one for reasons that will become obvious. Sam in Cambridge has texted in to say, who does the panel think will win the American election? Bonnie Greer. It's not Bonnie Greer who's going to win the American election. It's Bonnie Greer who's going to answer the question.
And it's a neck-and-neck election now. Donald Trump is the front runner, and I'm for the vice president. I'm for Kamala Harris.
Wait, you think Donald Trump is still the front runner?
Oh yeah, don't think he's not. It's the vice president understands this clearly. The Democrats understand this. Trump is in front. He doesn't know it, but he's in front. So I would say that we'll see what the debate is going to be like next week. But so far, he's edged. He's still the front runner. So I don't know.
David, who do you think's going to win the American election?
I think, regardless of who wins the election, that person's going to be a really important ally to the UK. And we know there's a lot of common issues that we've discussed around things like housing, state of the economy. The US, which is the big engine of our economy, biggest investor in the UK, the biggest investor in the US, that's a shared set of issues that we know the US economy faces the same as we do. So being able to work with whoever is that new president, that new leader, is going to be critical to solving the problems that we share and on issues like Israel, which we've heard about, making sure that we're able to work effectively together for the wider benefit of the world. I'm not going to take political sides. I think it's for US citizens to make their judgment, as it is for British citizens.
Just ask your opinion. I mean, what do you think? I mean, of course you're not going to take a side. It's like, what do you think? Do you have an opinion about this? Or?
I think it's very important that our most important ally in the world is the citizens of that country are able to make their decision. And I take the view, as I do in my own party's leadership election,
Alison McGovern,
I will work with and support whoever wins that election.
Alison McGovern, if it's Trump, can the government of Keir Starmer find a way of working with him?
We will have to, yes, of course. I'm a Kamala Harris fan. I think she's fantastic, and no administration is perfect, but I think what the Biden administration has done in many areas is really good. But we work with whoever gets elected. Of course, it's for the American people.
Politicians. It'd be great to have two prosecutors as one head of America, one head of here.
All right. Well, Henry Hill is not a politician, but he writes about politics. Who do you think is going to win this election in the United States?
I think might probably lean Trump much more narrowly. The transition to Kamala Harris as a candidate has clearly really wrong-footed his campaign, and he hasn't really righted it yet. But I think that the flip side of that is that Joe Biden neutralised a lot of Trump's advantages by really appealing to centre-ground voters. That's how he really carried that election in 2020. And Kamala Harris, whilst running a very good campaign on a lot of issues in the past, she's been quite a bit further away from the centre ground on some of those issues. So the question is whether or not there are voters in swing states.
Trump's got a big problem, and I don't underestimate Donald Trump. He's probably the best marketeer of the age. This guy knows how to sell. Okay, Trump knows he's in trouble because he hasn't been able to figure out our reproductive rights issues. That's the biggie in America. It's going to be reproductive rights, and women are the voters in the United States. We don't like him.
Okay, I'm going to be in big trouble if I don't now move on to the fun question that will end Cross Question and every edition of Cross Question, a different question each time, of course. Tonight's comes from Paul, who asks on text, some Oasis tickets went for £355 on Ticketmaster. Who would have to play for members of the panel to pay that much money? Alison.
Well, I think the factual the answer to this, from my point of view, is I pay quite a lot more than that to watch Liverpool Football Club play. So I guess the actual answer is LFC. But I don't think that, I can't think of anyone really. I like music a lot, and I watched lots of bands play in Birkenhead. We had a fantastic music festival headlined by an amazing singer called Nadine Shah.
Worth 355 quid?
It wasn't that expensive, no.
Henry Hill.
I'm in a trance. All my favourite DJs are alive, and you can see them for about 40 quid. But I suppose if you had to pick one, Robert Miles, if I thought that the 350 was covering the cost of bringing him back from the dead, would be worth the price of the ticket.
David Simmonds.
Champagne Supernova is on my personal playlist, but I must admit, I've got young kids for 355 quid. I could entertain them with a lot of different stuff. So I think that's how I choose to spend the money.
Bonnie Greer.
I'd pay to see Donald Trump sing No Regrets, No Rien.
Je ne regrette rien by Donald Trump.
I pay for that. I would actually pay $355. Other than that, like other people have said, my people read the Heavenly Chorus. They ain't here no more.
I think you're all wrong. The correct answer is Delamitri. My thanks to the panel that have been with me this evening. Alison McGovern, the Employment Minister. David Simmonds, the Shadow Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Housing. Bonnie Greer, playwright, author and Byline Times columnist. And Henry Hill, the Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome. And thank you all for calling in with your questions. We'll do another cross-question tomorrow night. But in the next hour, we're going to look, as I said, at the government's decision to change the way in which Ofsted assesses the performance of the nation's schools. There will be no more single-word ratings for schools following a campaign led by the family of Ruth Perry, the headmistress who tragically killed herself after Ofsted told her that her school was going to be deemed inadequate. Now the government says it will produce more information to give parents more of an opportunity to assess local schools. No more one-word descriptives. If you're a parent, have you really got time to read a detailed report about a prospective school for your kids? And if you're a teacher, won't the new regime take